Welcome to This is Oregon, the podcast where we take you inside research happening at the University of Oregon and show you how it applies to your daily life. I'm Ed Dorsch, your host for this episode. Today, I'm talking with Mary Christina Wood, the Philip H. Knight Professor of Law. Mary is the founding director of the law school's Environment and Natural Resources Law Center. Her groundbreaking legal strategy called Atmospheric Trust Litigation was put into practice in 2010 when 21 youth plaintiffs represented by the nonprofit Our Children's Trust filed a landmark climate lawsuit. Last March, the Supreme Court declined an appeal for Juliana v. United States, but the lawsuit and Mary's bold assertion that the public trust doctrine applies to fossil fuel policies inspired a global groundswell of litigation. That includes successful lawsuits in Montana and South Korea, as well as a groundbreaking settlement in Hawaii. And dozens of similar cases are working their way through the courts around the world. In recent years, Wood has been breaking trail again. We're going to talk about her latest work at the vanguard of legal scholarship. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you.
You and I are both lifelong Oregonians, but in fact, you're a fifth-generation Oregonian. Tell me a little bit about what it was like growing up. I know you explored the natural wonders of the state that both of us love, but you also witnessed the loss of farms, forests, and wetlands. How did this experience help spur your environmental work?
Well, I grew up on the banks of the Columbia River, and as a child, I played in the forests and biked through endless farmlands. But in just the few years that I was in high school, developers got hold of that area and really started ravaging it. And they turned all of these forests and farmlands into pop-up malls and endless subdivisions with McMansions. And for me, it was personally devastating to watch something so rich with natural beauty and function just disappear in a matter of a few years. And I thought to myself then, in high school, I want to devote my career to protecting these natural systems. And I knew even then, before I went to law school, that the law wasn't working because there were plenty of environmental laws, but the agencies were just dishing out permits to destroy these forests and rivers and wetlands with little regard for any of the consequences. And so I knew even back then that real change would have to come from outside that narrow box of statutory law.
And you've built a career at the vanguard of legal scholarship, leading the way, and most recently around the issue of climate change. And I have kind of a good news, bad news question for you next. First of all, why should we be concerned about climate change? And on the flip side, why should we still have hope?
Well, nature has its own laws, and those laws are supreme. And you can consider climate balance as one of those laws. If we spew fossil fuel emissions and drive up the planet's average temperature, the climate system becomes disrupted, and we pay the price in loss of life and property loss and economic collapse. And there's just no negotiating our way out of those laws. And we see this kind of disruption all over the planet now in the form of huge wildfires and megastorms and unprecedented floods and collapsing ice sheets and sea level rise. The very scary aspect to this is that nature does have a point of no return. And if we pass that, we can't come back to a safe place in terms of climate. We are now precariously near that threshold. And our federal government is pushing down on the accelerator of fossil fuels, driving us towards that climate cliff as if there's no tomorrow. And so it's really, we're faced with an appalling disregard for human life and property and economic stability. So that is the bad news. And there's a ticking time clock to this. The good news, though, is associated with the bad news, and that is the climate disruption is just so bad, with people all over the world facing these unprecedented disasters, that there's just no denying the obvious. And people are demanding solutions and policy changes from government. People from all corners and walks of life are stepping up with this understanding that, we're all part of the problem in that we all participate in this fossil fuel economy. But that also means we can all be, and actually we all must be, part of the solution.
Absolutely. And as you said, that clock is ticking. 2024 was the warmest year by a wide margin since we began recording it in around 1850. And we're seeing a lot of the results of this in Oregon with wildfires and droughts and low snowpack. So it's both a global problem and a very local problem. Now, most people think of lawyers as taking cases to court or filing lawsuits, but you don't do that. You create the strategies and the legal frameworks that allow attorneys and organizations to take action on climate change. And I'd like to start with a strategy you developed years ago that has been and continues to be quite successful. Tell me a little bit about atmospheric trust litigation.
Well, atmospheric trust litigation came about in my mind when I realized that there was just no way the Clean Air Act would solve this climate crisis in time, because the agencies were just too politicized and too much in the hands of these powerful fossil fuel interests to really force what the statutory law authorized them to do, and that is control fossil fuel pollution. The Clean Air Act had been around for years, 50 years, and it's always contained ample authority to regulate carbon emissions. But still today, there's no comprehensive regulation. And so I stepped back and outside of that box, and I applied what's known as the public trust principle, which I'd been writing about for some time, to the climate crisis. And that is a principle outside of statutory law that is just really simple to understand. And that is, government is a trustee of our crucial resources, and as a trustee must protect them not only for the present generation, but also future generations as well. And this principle had been applied many, many times with success in the water context. And its logic certainly applied to the atmosphere as well, which supports all of human civilization. So I began making speeches and doing press interviews, and a lawyer named Julia Olson attended one of those presentations and decided to take this theory to court. And she formed Our Children's Trust, a nonprofit organization, and began to bring cases on behalf of youth against government agencies demanding emissions reduction. And one of those was a federal case Juliana versus the United States tried here in Eugene, which has been called the biggest case on the planet because it was an effort to sue the federal government to force emissions reduction on that level. And while it was ultimately dismissed after a decade of litigation, it did lead to the declaration of a constitutional right to a stable climate system. And now youth have taken that right to court in cases around the country, and as you say, have met with some great success.
So I'm sure back then when you first came up with the idea, it seemed a bit out there, but we've seen that in time that can come to fruition. You plant a seed and a tree grows. So I'd like to talk about a new seed that you're planting, some new trail that you're breaking. Let's talk about your latest idea, the Pacific Northwest Framework for Atmospheric Recovery. What's the problem that you're working on?
Well, this is the other side of the climate equation. So we often just think of climate crisis as a problem of emissions or pollution, too much fossil fuel use, sending those pollutants into the sky. But we could halt all fossil fuel use tomorrow, and we would still be sliding towards a climate cliff. And that's because we have exceeded the highest safe level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by a long shot. Scientists estimate that 350 parts per million of atmospheric CO2 is really the highest safe level. And now we've careened past that. We're beyond 420 parts per million and still climbing fast. So it's that carbon pollution already in the sky that is causing havoc around the world. It's not tomorrow's pollution, actually, but yesterday's. So we have to engage in this massive sky cleanup, so to speak, in order to get levels back down around 350 parts per million. And you can think of it as analogous to a marine oil spill. If a big tanker spilled, millions of gallons of oil into the bay, there'd be no question that there would be a cleanup plan developed immediately, because everyone knows oil will destroy the function of that marine ecosystem that people and species rely on. Well, we can think of climate disruption as caused by a huge carbon spill in the sky, and it needs cleaning up so that we can achieve climate balance once again. You can kind of think of this as an overflowing bathtub. Scientists use this analogy all the time, where there's a spout running water into the already full bathtub. Those would be the emissions. You've got to close the spout, But imagine that the drain is also plugged. You've got to correct the problem, unplug the drain to return equilibrium to the bathtub. And that's basically what you have to do with the atmospheric pollution that we've got. Stop emissions, that is the spout, but also we've got to drain the atmosphere of the excess legacy carbon that's already there. And if we don't do that, we still plunge into climate tipping points.
So we have this overflowing bathtub making a big mess, and first we need to turn off the spigot, but then we need to pull that plug and let the bathtub drain. How do we do that? How do we clean up that proverbial oil spill and scrub all that carbon out of the sky that's there right now?
Well, unfortunately, there's no magic vacuum cleaner to suck carbon out of the sky. But fortunately, nature has its own engines to draw down and sequester carbon through vegetation and soils. It's called the carbon cycle. Basically, nature absorbs carbon through plants and soils and also the ocean. And these are found across 4 ecotypes, basically forests, farmlands, grasslands, and blue carbon areas. The problem is that we've gummed up these engines by destroying these ecosystems so they don't function to absorb as much carbon as they should. We've clear-cut the forests, we've damaged soils through industrial agriculture, we've destroyed wetlands, we've overgrazed grasslands. Scientists have delineated what are called natural climate solutions to restore these ecosystems, and when you restore them, you boost their natural capacity to clean up the sky. Well, there are many, many pilot projects around this region and elsewhere that show the effectiveness of these natural climate solutions, but they are few and far between. And so what's needed is a global effort to accelerate and scale up natural climate solutions across really the broadest territory possible worldwide.
Now, I think most of us know what a farm is, as well as a forest or a rangeland, but what is a blue carbon area?
Blue carbon areas are those areas in the tidal zones. Basically, they hold estuaries that have great potential to store carbon. And many of these have been effectively dewatered by levees and such to achieve flood control. But the reasons for these water impediments sometimes no longer exist. So some can be removed to re-water the blue carbon area and jumpstart its carbon sequestration abilities once again.
I think those of us in Oregon probably all have our own favorite blue carbon areas along the coast. And these solutions that you're proposing offer additional benefits to communities, right? Like fish habitat, mitigation from flooding or big waves and that kind of thing. Is that right?
Oh, by all means. Flood control, pure water, species, fisheries, protection, all of that, recreational opportunities. So they are filled with co-benefits.
So tell me about your plan for a solution.
Well, one has to really think on a global level here, and because it's a planetary effort to sequester and store the amount of carbon necessary. And it must fall, although it's a planetary effort, to regions around the world, regions that hold the ecotypes with potential for this major carbon drawdown. So really, the world needs something of a Marshall Plan, if you will, that kind of rebuilds ecology that can sequester carbon. But regions worldwide are still operating according to the way they have for decades, and the status quo is not going to restore the ecosystems necessary to draw down carbon. So we conceived of an organizational framework on a regional level that details the components necessary to any regional sky carbon cleanup. And these components are pretty basic. We start with the natural climate solutions. Those are the protocols that can boost sequestration, things like restoring estuaries and protecting forests from clear cutting. And for every prescription, we also addressed, how do you implement those and what barriers stand in the way? What are their costs? How would you monitor these to make sure that carbon really is, in effect, being sequestered and stored? And then, of course, we also focus on those vast co-benefits associated with these techniques like flood control, and water purification, storm buffers, and recreational opportunities so that communities can see that this isn't just about carbon sequestration. And then finally, each protocol needs some durability so that the next farmer or the next forester doesn't just undo all of the efforts by, say, cutting the forest that was sucking out carbon, or returning land to industrial agriculture and releasing the stored carbon.
This all sounds like it will cost a lot of money. Who pays for it?
It will cost a lot of money because it's a huge global endeavor. If you think about who should pay for it, well, my analogy is a marine oil spill. Let's say a company had a tanker that spilled millions of gallons of oil into the bay. There would be absolutely no question that the company that owned the tanker or the petroleum would pay for the cleanup. And so really the fossil fuel companies should pay for this cleanup. And there are lawsuits against fossil fuel companies around this country, but basically the lawsuits are asking for a different form of damages. They're asking for adaptation damages, so money to build seawalls and provide more cooling centers and fire protection and so forth. And there's just no adaptation possible in a climate system that's out of control. So none of that money would go towards solving the problem. Whereas what's really needed is to have the fossil fuel companies pay for a cleanup of the pollution problem that they've caused.
Another thing that you brought up is that the first cities that win those sorts of lawsuits will get the seawalls and the cooling centers, but the rest of us would kind of be out of luck. So it's really not a viable solution.
That's right. There's a real environmental justice component to this because most places on Earth won't get a penny because the coffers will be drained in the first couple lawsuits.
And this might seem a little far-fetched, but there have actually been similar examples, albeit smaller in scope, that have worked. I know you've talked about paint manufacturers, for example, in California, who paid for lead abatement in homes. It's analogous to that, but a lot grander in scale, right?
Right. And even more recently, there's been settlements of lawsuits against manufacturers of PCBs. And those settlements have been huge, and they occurred in the state of Oregon, in Seattle. And these actually bring money damages to the state agencies in Oregon to clean up PCBs across all sorts of environmental media, like waters and species and soils and so forth. So that's a really great analogy, and the legal theory is exactly the same as the theory that would be used to hold fossil fuel companies accountable, and that is they're accountable for natural resource damages to a public trust resource.
So let's get down to brass tacks. What's a specific example of how that kind of money from a settlement that's recovered for carbon pollution could be put to work right here in the Northwest?
Oh, well, it could pay farmers to change their practices on their lands. They might change their practices to plant cover crops or row cropping. It could pay ranchers for transitioning to what we might call regenerative grazing, where they have more hired hands, but they bunch their cattle in ways and move their cattle through grasslands in ways that are more concentrated, and so they don't destroy the roots of the vegetation. It could pay for conservation easements on forests that you want to keep standing so that they absorb carbon dioxide. It could pay for huge restoration projects along the coast to rewater estuaries that have been drained from levees and so forth. So there's really no end to what you can do. The land is overall in a very different condition than it was 200 years ago. And nature had its own processes of carbon sequestration. We've basically just thrown a wrench into most of those.
Now, first of all, I think it's important to understand that all of this would be voluntary, right? And then the Pacific Northwest would really be your blueprint for other regions to emulate in this spinning up of natural carbon sequestration systems that we already have in place. And then tell me a little bit about how other regions could emulate what we're doing here in the Pacific Northwest.
Well, we focused on the Pacific Northwest first as the lead region in this global effort because if you think about it, we have a very unique region here. We have all four ecotypes. We have some of the most massive carbon sequestering forests on planet Earth in our west side mature Doug fir forests, at least what is left of them. And we have vast farmlands, grasslands, and also the estuaries of the ocean. We also have a league of scientists and land managers and tribes and groups all over the region interested in scaling up these natural climate solutions. So I think the Pacific Northwest is an ideal region to lead the way and also to inspire other regions across Earth to do the same.
And this really is a grassroots strategy. And I think part of the strength of your new legal blueprint is that you have and will involve many different people at the local level, right?
Yes, this framework, as you mentioned, is not a regulatory framework. It's an organizational framework. So it maps the way to implement natural climate solutions, but it depends on communities to take it forward if they so choose. And because land is managed by so many different people and agencies, this region-wide effort would involve tribes and farmers and foresters and ranchers and restoration professionals and many, many others. You can really think of this, I like to think of it, as a movement, an absolutely necessary one if we are to restore our climate system and secure a safe future for our children.
And what you're talking about is not hypothetical. All those constituents you've mentioned, as I understand it, are groups that you've already been working with for this first plan that you're developing. So this is really happening.
Right. We did tremendous outreach over the course of 3 or 4 months.
And then the idea is that our region, the Pacific Northwest, could be a prototype for other law schools around the country and around the world. They could create their own regional frameworks.
Yeah, and the stage we're at right now is we are nearly done with completing the framework. So the research is done and the writing is nearly done. So we are ready now to hand it off to basically an implementer who can take it forward in this region. And I envision a Pacific Northwest Atmospheric Recovery Institute that would be a consortium of top flight research universities in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And that institute could do the outreach necessary to get this off the ground in rural areas across the 3 states. And it could monitor the successes and failures and revise the framework, drawing upon this massive collective experience. And the really great thing for universities is by sending students and professors out to areas to monitor and study these natural climate solutions as they are being implemented and engaging with the actual land managers, universities can train and grow new professional pathways for their students. And then once it is off the ground, I also envision other law schools as performing the same function we did in the Pacific Northwest in their own regions as well. This would be a fantastic project for law schools around the country to really jumpstart a framework for their regions.
Frankly, it all seems really ambitious, but I know that new and bold is kind of what you do. Do you think it could really happen?
Yeah, well, I have a simple answer to that. It must happen. It may take a century, but this effort must happen, and it's going to take participation from around the world. And the reason it must happen is because nature has its own laws, and we've really violated them by putting so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. If we don't clean up that carbon dioxide, we face kind of a hellish world of floods and fires and more sea level rise and so forth. So if we want a habitable planet, this must happen.
It's kind of an overwhelming problem. I think the magnitude of it can often cause folks to kind of shut down. And I'm curious, what gives you hope?
Well, what gives me hope is just encountering so many people that are enthusiastic about this idea. And when they first learn of it, they just think, that makes sense. What gives me hope, too, is encountering so many different people. Inevitably, people think, oh, I can meaningfully participate in this small way. And I always say, you can't save the world alone, but the world can't be saved without you.
Well, I think it does make sense. And your words give me hope. And so thank you, Mary. I appreciate your time today and all the important work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to my conversation with Mary Christina Wood about regional frameworks, a legal solution to the problem of climate change. If you're interested in learning more, check out the links in the episode description. And don't forget to follow This is Oregon for more stories from the University of Oregon. See you next time. This is Oregon is produced by the Division of University Communications. For more on the latest University of Oregon research and news, visit news.uoregon.edu or find us on your favorite social media platform using the handle @uoregon. Thanks for listening, and go Ducks.